In 1876, a trail cook on the Chisholm Trail fed 14 men for 90 days using nothing but a chuck box and a Dutch oven. His total budget was $40, less than 50 cents per man per day. Most of those men gained weight. Number 17 was eaten cold in the saddle at 3 in the morning during a lightning storm. Number 8 was so hated that cowboys threatened to quit, but it kept more men alive than anything else on the trail. Number 2 was invented by accident when a cook dropped the wrong ingredient into the pot and created something cowboys begged for every night after. These meals were not cooked in kitchens. They were cooked in dust storms, river crossings, and 100-degree heat. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 25 forgotten meals cowboys actually ate on cattle drives to survive. Number 25, Firewater coffee. Before any food was made, before the sun cracked the horizon, the cook had coffee boiling. Trail cooks threw 2 fistfuls of coarsely ground arbuckles into a pot of river water and boiled it until it turned black as axle grease. Then they cracked a raw egg, shell and all, and dropped it in. The egg white attracted the loose grounds and pulled them to the bottom. What was left was a murky, brutally strong liquid that cowboys drank by the quart. The caffeine was not a luxury. It was medication. After sleeping on rocky ground for 4 hours between night watches, coffee was the only thing that made a body functional. Cowboys called weak coffee belly wash and would openly insult any cook who made it. A pound of arbuckles cost about 15 cents, and it was the single most important supply on any cattle drive. Number 24, Pecos River stew. When a steer broke a leg crossing rough ground or got bitten by a rattlesnake and had to be put down, the cook claimed the fresh meat and made Pecos River stew. The beef was cut into rough chunks, tossed into the Dutch oven with wild onions dug from the prairie, whatever potatoes were left in the wagon, and enough water to cover everything. Then the lid went on, and coals were piled on top and beneath. 3 hours later, the stew had thickened into something rich and dark that tasted nothing like the salt-cured pork cowboys ate the other 29 nights of the month. Fresh beef was rare on the trail because you could not slaughter your own product. Every steer was money walking, so an injured animal was a tragedy for the trail boss and a celebration for the cook. Number 23rd, sinkers. These were the biscuits that nobody romanticizes, not the fluffy sourdough rounds that food writers describe in cowboy cookbooks. Sinkers were what happened when the cook was exhausted, the sourdough starter was sluggish from a cold night, and 14 men needed bread in 30 minutes. Flour, water, a pinch of salt, and a scrape of lard mixed fast and baked hard in the Dutch oven until they came out dense enough to stop a bullet. Cowboys called them sinkers because dropping one in a cup of coffee proved the name. They sank straight to the bottom. But here is what nobody mentions. Sinkers traveled. A cowboy could shove 2 in his coat pocket at dawn and gnaw on them through a 12-hour shift in the saddle without them falling apart. They were trail food in the purest sense. Ugly, hard, and completely reliable. Number 22nd, bacon grease gravy. The most important substance on any cattle drive was not water. It was bacon grease. Every morning, after the salt pork was fried, the cook strained the hot drippings into a tin can and guarded it like gold. When it came time to stretch a meal, he spooned that grease into a skillet, stirred in flour until it turned golden, and added water or coffee to thin it into a thick gravy that covered everything: biscuits, beans, boiled rice, cornmeal mush. Bacon grease gravy turned whatever was underneath it into a meal that stuck to a man's ribs for 6 hours of hard riding. The fat delivered calories that protein and starch alone could not match. Cowboys burning 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day in the saddle needed that fat to survive. A cook who ran out of bacon grease was a cook who had failed his crew. Number 21. Dry camp jerky. On nights when there was no water for cooking, no creek nearby, and no time to stop, cowboys ate jerky and nothing else. This was not the seasoned, tender jerky sold at gas stations. These were strips of beef salted until they were nearly white, then dried in the sun over the wagon for 2 or 3 days until they turned stiff as rawhide. You did not bite through it. You tore a piece and wedged it between your cheek and your gum, like chewing tobacco, working it for 20 to 30 minutes until enough saliva softened it to swallow. One strip could last an hour. The salt kept it preserved for months in a canvas sack, but it also made a man desperately thirsty. Dry camp nights meant jerky and prayer that tomorrow would bring water. Trail journals from the 1870s describe entire crews going silent on dry camp nights. No songs, no stories, just the sound of men chewing leather in the dark. Number 20. Prairie coal beans. When the trail crossed treeless plains and no firewood was available, cooks burned dried buffalo chips, cattle dung that the wrangler collected in a canvas sack. Cowboys called them prairie coal. The beans cooked over prairie coal tasted exactly the same as beans cooked over mesquite, but the psychological barrier was real. New hands from back east sometimes refused to eat food cooked over dung until hunger won the argument, usually by the second day. The cooks soaked pinto beans overnight, then simmered them all the next day with a chunk of salt pork, while the herd moved slow across the flats. By supper, the beans had turned creamy and thick. A single pot fed the whole outfit. Number 19. Canned tomato straight. When tinned tomatoes became affordable in the late 1870s, trail bosses started buying them by the case. Cowboys ate them cold, straight from the can, standing in the shade of the wagon during the noon break. The acid cut through the grease that coated every meal. The juice was the closest thing to fresh fruit a man would taste for 3 months. Some outfits rationed them to half a can per man per day. Others let the crew fight over them. First come, first served. Diaries from the period describe cowboys puncturing the can with a knife, tilting it back like a drink, and draining the juice before eating the tomatoes with their fingers. A case of 24 cans cost about $2.50 at Dodge City. Trail cooks who stocked canned tomatoes were considered generous. Those who did not were considered dangerous because the vitamin C in those tomatoes was quietly preventing scurvy on drives that lasted 4 months. Number 18. Sourdough flapjacks. The sourdough starter was the heartbeat of the chuck wagon. Cooks carried it in a wooden keg lashed to the wagon, and on cold nights some wrapped it in a blanket or tucked it against their body to keep the yeast alive. Every morning the cook pulled a cup of starter, mixed it with flour, a pinch of sugar, and a spoonful of lard, then poured thin rounds onto a greased skillet balanced on rocks over the fire. The flapjacks came out tangy, slightly sour, and golden at the edges. Cowboys stacked 3 or 4 high, poured molasses or cane syrup over the top, and ate them with their hands. No forks on the trail for flapjacks. A stack of 6 delivered enough starch and sugar to carry a man through a morning of hard work. When the starter was strong, those flapjacks puffed slightly and tasted almost like real bread. When the starter was weak from cold or neglect, they came out flat and gummy. Cowboys could judge the health of the sourdough by the first bite, and they let the cook know about it. Number 17. The cold biscuit and bacon pocket meal. During night watches, stampede alerts, and river crossings that ran past dark, cowboys could not return to the wagon for a hot meal. The cook would wrap cold biscuits, split around slabs of fried salt pork, in a piece of cloth and hand them out before the men rode into the dark. This was the meal eaten one-handed in the saddle at 3 in the morning while circling nervous cattle during a thunderstorm. The biscuit was stale by then. The bacon was cold and congealed. None of that mattered. What mattered was that a man had something in his stomach when lightning cracked the sky and 3,000 longhorns decided to run. Cowboys ate these pocket meals more often than any trail memoir admits. The romantic campfire supper happened when conditions allowed. The cold biscuit in the rain happened every other night. Number 16, spotted dog. Different from spotted pup, spotted dog was a boiled suet pudding studded with dried currants or raisins and sweetened with brown sugar. The cook mixed flour, rendered beef suet, chopped fine, sugar, and dried fruit into a stiff dough, wrapped it tight in a flour sack, and boiled it in a pot of water for 2 hours. The result was dense, sticky, and sweet enough to make grown men close their eyes while chewing. Suet was free, trimmed from whatever beef the outfit slaughtered. The dried fruit came in 10-pound boxes from the supply wagon. This was the dessert that appeared maybe once a week if the cook was feeling generous. Cowboys who had not tasted sugar in days would scrape their tin plates clean and sit quiet for a minute afterward. That silence was the only thank you most cooks ever received. If you want a full collection of simple meals like these, I made a cookbook with 100 recipes. Number 15, shuck beans and side meat. Dried shuck beans and salt pork were staples. Green beans were strung on thread and hung to dry in the sun for weeks until they turned brown and leathery. Packed into cloth sacks, they weighed almost nothing and lasted months without spoiling. On the trail, the cook would soak a handful overnight, then simmer them for hours with a piece of salt pork until they rehydrated into something that tasted surprisingly like fresh green beans with a smoky depth. This was the only vegetable most cowboys ate for the entire drive. Southern cooks had been drying beans this way since the 1700s. The technique migrated west with every cattle outfit that left Texas heading north. Number 14, lick and bread. When the molasses barrel was running low and supper was thin, cowboys made do with lick, their word for molasses, drizzled over whatever bread was available. A torn chunk of sinker, a cold sourdough biscuit, a slab of corn dodger. It did not matter. Dipped or drizzled with dark sorghum molasses, it became a meal. The sugar hit was immediate, the calories were real, and the taste, that deep, almost burnt sweetness of sorghum, was one of the few genuinely pleasant flavors on the entire drive. A gallon of sorghum molasses cost about 40 cents and could last a crew 2 weeks if the cook rationed it. Cowboys who snuck spoonfuls straight from the barrel were punished with extra night watch duty. The temptation was worth it. First pattern break. Here is what no movie ever shows you. The trail cook worked harder than any cowboy on the drive. He woke at 3 in the morning to start breakfast. He drove the chuck wagon ahead of the herd to set up camp at the next stop. He dug fire pits, hauled water, mixed dough, and served 2 full meals a day to 14 moom who would complain no matter what he put on their plates. Then he cleaned every pot, packed every supply, and did it again the next day for 3 straight months. The cook's average pay was $5 more per month than a regular hand, and most trail bosses considered that a bargain because a bad cook could destroy a drive faster than a flooded river. Cowboys would quit over terrible food. They would ride for months over good food. The cook controlled morale, and morale controlled everything. Number 13, stewed dried apples with cinnamon. Dried apples packed in burlap sacks were one of the few fruits that survived weeks in a jostling supply wagon. The cook would pour a couple of handfuls into a pot of water with a spoonful of sugar and a pinch of cinnamon and simmer until the hard, leathery rings plumped back into something almost recognizable as fruit. The smell alone could change the mood of an entire camp. Cowboys who had eaten nothing but salt and grease for 10 straight days would inhale that cinnamon and apple sweetness, and something in them softened. One trail hand from the Chisholm Trail wrote in his diary that stewed apples made him think of his mother's kitchen, and he had to walk out past the horses so nobody saw his face. That is not a recipe. That is medicine. Number 12, corn dodger and dripping. When flour ran low or cost too much at frontier trading posts, cornmeal took over. Corn dodgers were dense cakes of cornmeal, water, and salt, shaped by hand and fried in whatever fat was available, usually bacon drippings. They came out golden on the outside and gritty on the inside, heavy as stones and twice as filling. Cowboys stuffed them in coat pockets and ate them cold between meals. The dodger soaked up gravy and bean juice like a sponge, which was its real purpose. Nobody ate corn dodgers alone by choice, but corn dodgers in a bowl of bean broth was a meal that carried a man through a full afternoon of cutting strays from the brush. Cornmeal cost half what wheat flour did, and a 50-pound sack lasted for weeks. Number 11, creek water rice. When a drive passed near a trading post, or when the supply wagon carried rice, the cook made a pot so large he needed both hands to lift it off the fire. Plain white rice boiled in creek water, seasoned with salt, and whatever drippings were left from the morning bacon. It sounds like nothing. But rice stretched every other dish the cook made. Beans over rice, gravy over rice, stewed tomatoes over rice. The rice absorbed flavors and turned a single pot of beans into twice as many servings. Outfits that carried rice ate better than outfits that did not, and every experienced trail boss knew it. Number 10, belly cheater stew. Belly cheater, a makeshift survival stew. When supplies ran critically low and the cook had to invent something from almost nothing, the result was called belly cheater. Whatever was left in the chuck box went into the pot. A handful of dried beans, some crumbled hardtack, a strip of jerky torn into pieces, wild onions if someone had pulled them from the ground that day, water and salt. The stew simmered for hours while the cook prayed it would thicken into something he could serve without getting cursed at. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. The name itself was honest. This stew was not meant to satisfy. It was meant to cheat the belly into thinking it was full long enough to get a man through the night. Cowboys ate it without complaint on those nights because they understood the math. The nearest supply point was 3 days away, and complaining would not make it closer. Number 9, son of a gun stew. Every experienced trail cook knew this recipe, and every Eastern journalist who witnessed it wished he did not. When a calf was slaughtered on the trail, the cook claimed the organs: heart, liver, kidneys, sweetbreads, tongue, and the marrow gut, the tube connecting the calf's stomachs that contained partially digested milk. Everything was cut into small pieces and simmered together with onions and chili peppers for hours. The marrow gut gave the stew a distinctive creamy richness that no other ingredient could replicate. Cowboys considered it a celebration meal, served only when fresh beef was available. The dish wasted nothing and honored the animal completely. Those organ meats delivered concentrated doses of iron, B12, and zinc that kept men healthy through months of brutal labor. Second pattern break. Here is something trail records make clear, but Hollywood never shows. Cowboys got sick constantly. Dysentery from bad water, scurvy from no vegetables, infected cuts from barbed brush, and rope burns. The cook was not just the chef. He was the closest thing to a doctor the outfit had. He kept castor oil, quinine, and turpentine in the chuck box alongside the flour and salt. A cook who could feed men well kept them healthy enough to work. A cook who cut corners on nutrition lost hands to illness, and losing hands meant losing cattle, which meant losing money. The food was not a perk, it was infrastructure. Number 8, cornmeal mush. This was the meal cowboys hated most and ate most often when things went wrong. Cornmeal stirred into boiling water until it thickened into a pale, gluey porridge. No flavor, no texture, no pleasure. Just calories in the most efficient delivery system the trail could offer. When the bacon was gone, and the beans were gone, and the flour was gone, cornmeal mush was what stood between a crew and genuine starvation. Men choked it down with their eyes fixed on the horizon, counting the days until the next supply stop. Leftover mush was sliced and fried in the morning, which improved the texture but not the morale. The dish represented the absolute floor of trail cuisine. Its presence on the plate meant things were bad. Its absence from the plate meant things were worse. Number 7, trail boss steak. When the trail boss authorized slaughtering a steer, usually because the animal was lame or injured, the cook cut thick steaks from the hindquarter and seared them quickly in a smoking hot skillet. No seasoning beyond salt, no technique beyond heat. The outside charred dark, while the inside stayed red and juicy. Cowboys ate these steaks with their hands, the juice running down their wrists. Fresh beef on the trail was so rare that men talked about specific steaks for years afterward. Trail memoirs record hands remembering particular nights, the taste of that beef, the sound of the fire, the relief of something that was not salt pork or beans. Number 6, vinegar cobbler. Fresh fruit was impossible on the trail, but the craving for something sweet never stopped. Resourceful cooks made a mock fruit cobbler using vinegar, sugar, water, and a bit of nutmeg, simmered together to create a filling that tasted remarkably like tart apples. Biscuit dough was pressed into the top of the Dutch oven over the filling, and the whole thing was baked in coals until the crust turned golden. Cowboys who tasted it for the first time could not believe what they were eating. The vinegar mimicked citrus well enough to fool taste buds numbed by weeks of monotonous food. This recipe appeared in no cookbook. It lived in the memories of trail cooks who passed it to one another at outfitting camps in Texas before the drives headed north. Number 5, biscuits and redeye gravy. Hot biscuits smothered in redeye gravy. When the morning called for something beyond cold jerky and black coffee, the cook fried thick slices of salt pork until the edges curled and browned. Then he poured leftover coffee directly into the smoking hot pan, scraping up every bit of caramelized fond into a thin, reddish-brown gravy. Split biscuits went onto the plate first. The gravy went over the top. The bitter coffee cut through the heavy salt of the pork and created something almost balanced. This was the breakfast that told cowboys the cook respected them. It required no extra ingredients, just care and timing. The difference between a good morning and a bad one on a cattle drive often came down to whether the biscuits were hot and the gravy was right. Everything that happened after breakfast, the riding, the roping, the river crossings, started with this plate. Number 4, spotted piup. This was the dessert that made hard men sentimental. Boiled rice folded together with raisins and sweetened with molasses or brown sugar, served warm from the Dutch oven. The dark raisins scattered through the pale rice gave it its name. Cowboys who recorded their memories decades later mentioned spotted pup with surprising tenderness. One hand from the loving trail called it the closest thing to home his outfit ever tasted. The sweetness cut through weeks of salt and grease. The raisins, plump from cooking, burst between the teeth with a concentrated fruitiness that felt luxurious in a world stripped bare of comfort. A cook who made spotted pup on a tough night earned loyalty that money could not buy. Number 3, mop sauce slow beef. On rare occasions, when time and supplies allowed, a trail cook would slow roast a section of beef over a low fire for hours, basting it with a mop sauce made from vinegar, bacon grease, salt, and crushed wild chili peppers. He used a rag tied to a stick, literally a mop, to paint the sauce over the meat as it cooked. The acid in the vinegar tenderized the tough trail beef, while the fat kept the surface from drying out. By evening, the meat was dark, crusty on the outside, and so tender it pulled apart with fingers. This was the ancestor of Texas barbecue, born not from backyard leisure, but from the practical need to make a tough old steer edible. Number 2, accidental tomato gravy on the trail. The story passed between chuck wagon cooks for decades. A cook on the Goodnight Loving Trail in the early 1870s meant to make a standard flour gravy. But he grabbed a can of crushed tomatoes by mistake and dumped it into the bacon drippings and flour. Rather than waste precious ingredients, he stirred it together and poured it over biscuits. The tomato cut the richness of the grease. The flour thickened everything into a bright, tangy gravy that tasted unlike anything the crew had eaten before. They demanded it every morning after. The recipe spread from outfit to outfit at gathering points in Texas and Kansas. What started as a mistake became one of the most beloved meals on the cattle trail. Number 1, beans. Not a special recipe, not a regional variation with a clever name, just beans. Dried pinto beans were soaked the night before in whatever pot was clean, then simmered all the next day with a chunk of salt pork and enough water to keep them covered. By supper, the beans had turned creamy, the broth thick with starch and rendered fat. The pork dissolved into salty threads throughout. This was the meal that appeared every single night on cattle drives from Texas to Montana, every night for months. Cowboys ate beans so often that the dish became a joke, a complaint, a curse word, and eventually a comfort. When everything else ran out, when the flour was gone, the rice was gone, the canned tomatoes were a memory, there were still beans. A 100-pound sack cost a few dollars and could feed a crew for weeks. No single food in American history has sustained more working men through more brutal conditions than a pot of pinto beans simmered with salt pork over an open fire. It was not exciting. It was not memorable. It was the reason men survived long enough to tell the stories we are still repeating today. If you want a full collection, I made a cookbook of 100 simple meals. The link is at the top of the description. Here is my challenge. Try one of these this week: the bacon grease gravy, the sourdough flapjacks, or the tomato gravy over biscuits. Then come back and tell me if those trail cooks were just getting by, or if they actually knew something we forgot. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if the spotted pup gets more love than the mop sauce beef. These were not just meals. They were the reason the cattle industry survived long enough to build the West.